So just to begin, this is a this is a photograph of a fire that I worked on with the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District, um, alongside the leaders at the Cafe Ohlone, um, and East Bay Ohlone Tribe. We see here in this photo, we're at the foot of Mount Diablo, also known as Tushtak. Um, and these are two Ohlone leaders setting a cultural burn right there at the Concord Center of Cal State East Bay. Um, and so this kind of really low intensity fire is something that historically was much more prominent and frequent throughout the East Bay. And so I think we have a lot to learn from that. Um, and so today I'll just share a bit of the what what we understand as the fire history of this region. And really there is insufficient data right before the colonial period, and even during, I would say, the Spanish colonial period and the beginnings of the Anglo-colonial period. Um, in these areas, not much was written down. Fire wasn't necessarily a focus of the first colonizers. Um, but as scholars, we're really interested in trying to figure this out, as it, of course, informs how we reintroduce fire into landscapes where it's been absent or it's been present in ways that perhaps are are novel to these areas in recent history, right? So there's a few things that I think, a few forms of data that inform our understanding of fire history. Um, and one of the primary forms of data is ethno-historical data. That is data that is gathered from, let's say, the journals of Spanish colonial conquistadors, um, and also the first-hand accounts of indigenous peoples as well. And then there's a set of data known as dendrochronological data, which are, I'll describe a bit later, but come from trees. There's also sediment cores that can provide some form of understanding of fire frequency in the past as well. And um, really, all of this points to the ubiquity of fire in California. Of course, we can also look toward the adaptive qualities of plants throughout California, which of course are extremely well adapted to fire, the majority of them, right? Um, and then of course there's time series photographs as well, and learning from that the fires that occur today. This is all critical to really understanding the past, because if we can define and monitor fires of today and understand how they behave today, they do give us a window into how they may have behaved in the past. And so we're interested in this because we want to create new relations with fire, as I said before. How do we relate to fire in a way that allows it to not cause such catastrophic outcomes? How do we use fire to sustain the different species that rely on it and the peoples that rely on fire dependent resources and species? So, in terms of ethno-historical data, I'm not going to review too much um, today, but these two books are seminal works that detail incredible amounts of fire knowledge that is held within California indigenous communities. And so I recommend them to all of you to explore and learn more about the immense knowledge and understanding of fire and really its fundamental part of California indigenous culture. Um, it was critical to maintaining all sorts of resources that without fire, those resources would not be available at the density necessary to sustain indigenous cultures. So I'm going to rely a bit here on a couple images that were generated by Dr. Rob Cuthrell in his dissertation here from UC Berkeley. Dr. Cuthrell has worked for many years with the Amamutsan tribal band and their land trust down in San Mateo County, as well as Santa Cruz County, as an archaeologist, an eco-archaeologist. And in his dissertation, he did some really thorough research on the journals and notebooks of Spanish colonizers who traveled the region initially, of course, to set up missions, um, but documented the landscape that existed as they were exploring the Bay Area for the first time. And so here we can see a path that they took along the San Mateo coastline in the fall months. And all of the triangles that we see are areas that they noted had been burned. And so fire was clearly very present along this pathway in certain places, and certainly in the East Bay, based on Cuthrell's review of these primary documents. And what's notable is also the types of flora that are present. So here in the East Bay, we see throughout um, the plains in Milpitas, in Fremont, in Hayward. These areas were noted by the Spanish colonizers to have little to no trees at all and were primary grassland. And given that they had been burned, right, this makes a lot of sense. Shrubs and trees are not as competitive or able to withstand repeated fire events. And so we can tell that fire was used um, to maintain grasslands. These are areas that certainly are now maintained as grasslands by repetitive grazing, but of course, fire plays a very similar role as herbivory. Um, and so Native people maintain these grasslands to support hunting grounds, to support certain foods that they relied on, especially seeds that were used to create porridges, as well as underground geophytes or what are known as Indian potatoes that flourish in open plains. And of course, the Spanish were really looking at these landscapes in order to sustain their missions. And so they were really interested, especially in grasslands. And much of the labor that went into creating and maintaining these grasslands was then taken advantage of by the Spanish uh, in the creation of their missions. And I'm happy to review this a bit more later if anyone has any questions. And please do, if there's a question, you can pop it in the chat. I won't see it now, but I'll return to it shortly. Here's another map. Uh, Interestingly, right, this is another reconnaissance mission by the Spanish that went into parts of Contra Costa County. Um, but it was in the spring, early spring, and no fire was noted, right? Obviously, the grass would be extremely green and almost impossible to burn. Um, but we see the large swath of grassland, this light green, and of course, lots of oak woodlands interspersed um, in these landscapes. And of course, these oak woodlands also, fire was applied regularly to maintain them um, so that understories would not get too dense, so that acorns, for example, one of the key foods of indigenous peoples, could be harvested efficiently. Um, and to support healthy trees, right? These large scale orchards that were fundamental to indigenous culture. Um, so these are really cool maps. You can download this dissertation um, and look at them yourself. But it's an incredible resource, and I give a lot of credit to Dr. Cuthrell and also Peter Nelson at UC Berkeley, who shared or encouraged me to look at this dissertation. But of course, once the Spanish actually set up the mission system in California, we know that there was a real animosity towards, of course, indigenous culture. Um, and indigenous burning was a vital part of that culture. And so it was really looked at as an uncivilized practice. But of course, today we see that these practices have been adopted by a lot of natural resource agencies. But Jose Joaquin de Arriaga, the interim governor of California in 1793, felt that the indigenous practice of burning was really problematic. And of course, this was guided by very kind of racist, ethnocentric views of the native peoples. So he calls them childlike, and as a result, he prohibits for the future all kinds of burning, not only in the vicinity of the towns, but even at the most remote distances. And so this raises an important, question about how this transformed the landscape. And fire, of course, consumes fuel, and in so doing, creates a really patchy, if it's done purposefully and across the landscape routinely, it creates a very patchy landscape wherein the fuel is not continuous, it's discontinuous, it's not connected, and thus it becomes harder for fire to spread. Now, in most parts of the East Bay today, we have a very continuous fuel distribution as a result of eliminating or laws like those imposed by the Spanish and then continued in many places by Anglo settlers. And so this continuous fuel distribution makes it much easier for fire to move quickly and at across very large areas, making it harder to control. And so purposeful, intentional, prescribed burning, right, um, is a really key tool to creating discontinuity within the landscape. And this is essentially what Native people were doing. But with the elimination of fire by the Spanish, we see a rapid shift to um, more and more fire during this period, which I'll share shortly. Um, So a dendrochronology is generated by taking um, trees and dating them, right? And dating also their fire scars. So we see this cat face on this ponderosa pine. Um, and it's a really good example of a pine that was burned repeatedly, right? It kind of creates a more open forest or woodland that we see here. But you can see how we can generate fire histories if we have a number of trees that can then be dated. And so wherever there's a fire scar here on this tree, we're able to then figure out how frequent fires occurred to a degree, right? Not every fire is actually going to scar a tree, especially if the fires are really low intensity, low severity, and happen frequently. So often you see trees like this, they'll have more and more scars in the period before colonization, um, and certainly in the period before fire suppression policy. And then fire scars pretty much disappear. And that's what aggregate data of these fire scarred trees helps us show and learn about fire. Now, in the Bay Area, there's very few fire scar tree studies, unfortunately. Um, and so we have to rely on studies from the Sierra Nevada, where there's a lot more trees that scar easily and that can be studied. And so as a result of that, we get these types of graphs, which may be a bit intense to look at. Um, but I'll try and explain it to you. Um, Basically, this fire index here is a, or this is an index of the fire occurrence and extent based on these dendrochronologies in the Sierra Nevada. And so we see this averaged line pretty much during this period before Spanish colonization, during the indigenous period of California. We also have here on the bottom, this is a graph of temperature anomalies in California. Um, and so we see actually a lot of temperature anomalies that occur, but the fire occurrence and extent stays pretty much the same throughout this period. Obviously, there's shifts, but if you average it out, um, and so it's interesting to see or to note that with climatic shifts in California, with a fire management program of intentional burning, the fire occurrence and extent doesn't necessarily change, right? Um, However, right, we see when once the Spanish prohibit fire, we see an increase in fire occurrence and extent in California, which is fascinating. Um, and it goes back to that question of fuel continuity, like I suggested earlier. Um, Indigenous burning, purposeful burning at during times of the year when fire can be controlled more, where weather is more moderate, uh, that no longer is occurring on such a massive scale because the Spanish outlawed it. And this, of course, affects peoples throughout Central California and the Sierras as well. Of course, they were impacted by the missions and by the diseases that were brought with the Spanish, significantly reducing indigenous populations. But then we see with the Anglo period, when industrial fire suppression becomes policy, we see a massive decline in fire occurrence and extent. And so this is actually just a zoomed in portion of this bottom graph in the past 100 or so years. starting in the 20th century, which generally is much lower compared to previous centuries, right? Um, and this is the result of purposeful fire elimination. Of course, we're experiencing somewhat of an uptick in fire occurrence and extent that doesn't compare nearly to the levels that it existed during the Spanish era or preceding that. But nonetheless, this perhaps, oh, sorry, is connected to changes in the climate, right? As well as the outcome of 100 years of fire suppression on the landscape. So this is the data from dendrochronology. Sediment cores pretty much come from lake bottoms, and basically you have surface runoff from forests or nearby landscapes. And so pollen is deposited, and also you have charcoal that runs off if there's fire on the landscape. And so in this way, you can tell kind of the patterns or degree to which fire existed on the landscape um, in the past as well through these sediment cores, which is really cool. And they can be dated as well. I'm not going to get into this too much, but I just wanted you all to be somewhat familiar with the techniques that are used by scientists. Um, the only sediment core that I'm aware of that looks closely at charcoal here in the SF Bay Area is taken from this small kind of wetland seep or bog in Point Reyes that actually I've never been to. Although I love hiking at Point Reyes. Never been to Glenmire. I'm not even sure if there's a real trail to it. But nonetheless, this group of researchers took a sediment core here at Glenmire, and this is the amount of charcoal influx over time. So it's really interesting to see kind of perhaps the adoption of fire by people on a large scale may have begun, perhaps according to this, maybe 3,000 years ago. Um, and this is essentially the same graph kind of zoomed in. So I want to focus here on this uh, part B and C. B is the sediment core and the charcoal flux beginning in in 1700, where it was higher, and then it precipitously declines in the late 1700s. And so this correlates strongly with what we saw in the Sierra Nevadas, and of course with the Spanish colonization of the Bay Area. Um, and then, of course, fire increases again in the Anglo period, beginning in the mid 19th century, and then it steadily declines, right? Um, so, of course, with logging and before fire suppression really took hold, there was a lot of burning, most likely, of some of the areas that had been logged to prepare sites for um, timber regeneration in this area, or perhaps even just to convert areas to grasslands. Um, and it's interesting, this here is the dendrochronology of a nearby site. So this is just some of the data that scientists use to piece together fire history. All right. And lastly, of course, there's photos. Maybe you've all seen this photo of the East Bay Hills. We can tell from the 50s to the 90s, um, there was been a shift from grasslands, which had likely been burned in the century or so before, um, converting to shrublands of baccaris or coyote brush as a result of fire's absence in both of these photos in the East Bay foothills around Tilden Park. Similarly, in other parts of the country, there's these time series photographs where you can see the changes to forests as well in the absence of fire. These forests become really dangerous tinderboxes that have extreme fuel continuity that allows fire to travel into the canopy, um, creating massive changes to forests, like in the Sierra Nevada. Of course, in the East Bay, there aren't really too many coniferous forests other um, than in the East Bay Hills around Oakland, right? But we can also see how forest treatments, intentional reduction of fuel loads um, by mechanical removal of certain trees can begin to replicate some of the initial landscape and ecological function that preceded colonization. And so I'll just end before I open it up for questions with, these images here of folks that are trying to bring prescribed fire and cultural fire back to the landscape. Of course, there's the Moraga Orinda Fire District, which is leading certain efforts to um, train up folks here in the East Bay to bring fire back in a purposeful way that is beneficial to both ecology and human resources, structures, and so on. And then Don Hankins, who may be participating in a future webinar, I'm not sure, is a Plains Miwok fire steward, also a professor at Cal State Chico, whose homelands include parts of the East Bay. Um, and so having folks like Don, who has immense fire knowledge, be a part of planning the reintroduction of fire to various landscapes is critical moving forward. Um, Developing comfortable relationships with fire is important so that we can mitigate the impacts of some of the really catastrophic fires that we've been experiencing, both in the East Bay and throughout California. Um, so here's my contact information, and I look forward to your questions.